Good morning, everyone. How are you? Great. A few voices out there. It's my pleasure to moderate the first group session this morning on the historic urban landscape recommendation. To preface this, I'll just make one or two observations. The first has to do with some of the remarkable presentations we had yesterday. Many things learned about different parts of the world, and picks up from some of the points of Gustavo's paper that we've just heard. And it has to do with this notion of cultural landscape, and maybe my own sort of personal connection to that term and what it has meant. Having grown up in being trained in geography and in urbanism, cultural landscape was always was inculcated to me as not a place, but a way of seeing every place. So in other words, not a piece of territory that one draws a line around and identifies as a cultural landscape, which implies that on the other side of the line is not a cultural landscape, but rather just a way of a theory, if you will, of understanding the multiplicity of resources, processes, histories, et cetera, that reside everywhere. And so this tension between cultural landscape as a way of looking and as a thing or an it was in my mind greatly yesterday. And I don't raise this as a criticism in any regard of all the wonderful things we heard yesterday and we'll hear today, but just to sort of acknowledge out loud that this is an issue, and I think it's a sort of a split personality or a personality disorder. I don't know about those of us who trade in this term cultural landscape. But there is room for hope and maybe some sorts of resolution in the topic of this first panel, the Historic Urban Landscape Recommendation, which those of you may already know is not the sort of policy or recommendation that is about drawing a line around certain places in the typical curatorial way, we could say, borrowing from Julian's terminology, but rather is a set of guidelines about approaching any place, and I would say probably urban as well as rural. But although as an urbanist, I favor the fact that there's urban with a capital U in the title. So I think that it's great to have this topic as the next one in the conference. I think it will suitably complicate and also help clarify some of what we may be able to take away from this great gathering of people. With no further ado, I will introduce, we'll go with the 5 speakers in the order in which they're listed in your program. The excellent program has, of course, very detailed bios that I won't read. I'll reduce it to one sentence at the hazard of offending anyone who's written those really beautifully long bios. But first, let me welcome Patricia O'Donnell, who is, just to go to the first line, the founder and principal of Heritage Landscapes, Preservation Landscape Architects and Planners. And so, Patricia, let me welcome you first.
Good morning. It's my pleasure to be here and participate in this panel. Just tell me what our foreword is so I don't get the beep beep thing. Got it. I actually have had the pleasure of being engaged in the discussions on the Hull recommendation since 2004 and participated in 2011 with Michael Turner and Francesco Banderin and Ron Van Oors and various others in the final drafting work, along with dozens and dozens of colleagues over that period of time who've contributed to this recommendation. And I think in this panel, my role is really to do sort of Hull 101, what is it, for those of you sitting here who may not even recognize that it has happened, that we have this November 2011 recommendation approved, and that it is for all urban places, not World Heritage. And importantly, it made a leap in the process of evolution from coming out of UNESCO World Heritage to actually coming out of UNESCO. So interestingly, this is the first sort of comprehensive statement on urban form that UNESCO has put forward since 1974. So this is a very important recommendation, and the sort of summary of it is that this is a bigger picture. It's a landscape scale thinking. It's starting with iconic architecture and starchitecture and city branding and all the threats that it was creating for urban form, particularly historic core cities. It evolved to be something that really is looking at a landscape scale and thinking beyond the notion of a historic center to the ensemble that includes the broader urban context. So the horizontal city of St. Petersburg was one that actually has survived a threat for the Gazprom tower, partially because of, I'm sure, because of the economic meltdown. But this presentation is really looking at the challenges of urban population, heritage, tourism, identity in the 21st century, the Hall recommendation for dynamic living cities, and integrated change management, which is kind of sort of the new lingua franca, integrated change management and dynamic. And then looking specifically a little bit, at least to introduce the 4 groups of tools that are outlined in this recommendation that are not all coming out of the heritage communities, that are coming out of a true, not only interdisciplinarity, but a democratic and inclusive kind of process. So this is kind of the spark, the tower competition globally. And I add to that image the kind of shifts, the tectonic shifts that have happened from monuments to include living cities as cultural landscapes, from restoration and development to management of change and regeneration, from expert monodisciplinary to integrative, participatory, collaborative, and partnership processes, from development to sustainable urban environments and local quality of life. And the Hall recommendation is basically a World Heritage, began as a World Heritage Initiative and shifted to this UNESCO-wide recommendation on urban form. So this kind of provocative satellite image tells us where our cities are globally. And with that, the Hall urban landscape approach aims at preserving the quality of the human environment and enhancing the productivity of urban spaces. It integrates the goals of urban heritage conservation with the goals of social and economic development. So this is a clear statement that says social and economic development and heritage can coexist if we do it in an appropriate way and if we work through a balanced and sustainable relationship. So what are our challenges? In the 21st century, urban heritage pressures are vast. Global urban populations crossed the 50% line. There's a lot of uncontrolled growth. At the same time, we have the out-migration from core industrial cities in the developing world. The projection is for 75% of the world population to be urban by 2030. There's a universal desire for healthful and vital urban environments globally that is largely unmet. So within that relationship, we have a series of transformations, socioeconomic and functional. There's all the pressures of climate change and environmental disasters, and the continuing role of those kinds of events that is just coming around the world. Degrading impacts of infrastructure and transportation, bigger isn't always better, and the global competition for economic growth with the whole process of development pressures moving toward the appropriation of urban heritage for corporate gain. Then we have the dynamics of tourism, which many see, as we just heard from Gustavo's presentation, a panacea, and it is going to be, and is right now, one of the large economic engines globally. So here are some of the issues. The whole issue of integration of resident and visitor needs and being, living in a fishbowl in a touristic community, and the processes of global competition for tourism dollars. There's a great construct that's come out of Europe that's called the experience economy, and it relates in great part to this notion that I mentioned yesterday about mobile global populations and people from various countries taking posts all over the world, and the fact that our communities have a greater mobility and a greater sense of a global reach. So there are tangible resources in historic urban landscapes, and we always use this kind of laundry list of the tangible, what we call character-defining features. And I won't read these out to you, but the image is of Rio, recently inscribed, and with Michael Turner, I and Katri Liston helped IFAN, the Brazilian ministry, frame that new nomination for Rio as the Carioca landscape between land and sea. And the intangible heritage, San Juan Chimula in Mexico, here at a Mayan worship and celebration happening in front of the church in the square, with the whole list of the, a partial list of intangible heritage that resides in the historic urban landscape at various scales and types, with the recognition that documentation is a baseline and that needs to be led by local voices. So the four sets of tools: civic engagement tools, knowledge and planning tools, regulatory systems, and financial tools. Traditionally, in heritage, we may cross boundaries and touch all of these. In general, we see ourselves bringing forward the knowledge and planning tools. So it's clear that we have to collaborate in broader spheres to deal with all four sets of tools and to bring those forward effectively for urban heritage in this world of managing change and meeting multiple objectives. So the civic engagement tools, accessible multi-platform planning has really come forward with social media and the web. We're finding a real sense of the inadequacy of traditional public meetings and forums. People are doing pretty well with charrettes. They're doing better with web outreach, but there's a whole lack of transparency in that that's problematic. So we need to keep developing tools, as well as the great pictures of Richard Leventhal sitting and talking to the people in the Mexican community yesterday, which of course is a one-on-one exchange, but it relates to who's in the circle and who's sitting there. Knowledge and planning tools, this view from the Fortaleza over the historic city of Old Havana. And we have a number of these. We talk about documentation. We're dealing with the tangible for the most part, but the skill sets that document the intangible have to be side by side. And urban viewscapes and mapping is an important tool that can come forward more effectively, and a series of others. Targeted urban preservation that manages the evolution and addresses tourism integration with those who live in a place. So here's an interesting case. A colleague, Hal Muggeridge from the UK, has worked out a notion in planning that he calls defining the sky. And he used that in Edinburgh to develop a mapping from the important places that were shared iconic areas in the city of Edinburgh, so that the zoning for the city now requires a developer to come in with a proposal that meets the model. So it's become a legal tool to control development, which is not about each site and its capability. It's about how it relates to the Commonwealth of what the image and identity of the city of Edinburgh provides. Regulatory systems incorporate heritage from the position of zoning, conservation easements, historic district laws, and importantly, I think, more recognition of traditional and customary systems and indigenous peoples. The farming techniques at the Grand Pré in Newfoundland on the Bay of Fundy were very interesting to me when I had the pleasure to investigate those to a degree, to understand that over several hundred years, the maintenance of the dike land and the adjacencies of the communities were integrated in their management strategies. So here in my own town of Charlotte, Vermont, on Lake Champlain, we've taxed ourselves to bring funds forward to be able to conserve these lands that are shown in green. So here, the process really says that the citizens wish to, through a small town land trust, developing a series of partners to retain the identity of their community. And here, our current work at the National Mall, where we are a member of a large team working on a sustainable design for our national front lawn. And the financial tool that was brought into play there was the ARA funding, the American Resources Recovery Act that President Obama put forward to develop the mall. And in this case, we are doming the ground, capturing the rainwater in the curb, bringing it to 2 new cisterns, and re-irrigating the lawn with rainwater. So for the first time, a sort of very important project rooted totally in sustainable practices. And in New York City, similarly, under Clean Water Act laws, and many cities are doing this, Chicago and several others, they're looking again at their infrastructure of pipes under the ground that are taking poor quality water to the rivers that are, and water bodies that are adjacent to their cities, and looking for other ways of doing it. So New York City is going to do a whole new approach to green infrastructure with substantial funding, and bring forward the process of quelling urban heat island at the same time by infiltrating water in these sidewalk side planters. Now, if we look at that from a historic preservation perspective, one of the things that we would see in the evolution of New York City is that there were these verges. They've disappeared over time and become what we call tree coffins, little vaults where the trees die because they don't have enough soil and air and water. And then now what they're saying is they're going to dish those and bring all the rainwater to them and infiltrate the water and not put it in the underground pipes and save literally billions of dollars in compliance of stormwater management. So stormwater management becomes an interesting aspect of, and compliance with Clean Water Acts becomes an interesting aspect of the urban future. So just to wrap up, an example of 80 years of guided community change is historic Charleston, our first historic district in the United States, and just a, a sort of summary list of what they've done over the period from 1931 as the first USA historic district all the way down to the 2010 Charleston Green Plan that integrates heritage and sustainability. So, in closing, Hull broadens the framework for our global Commonwealth of Urban Heritage through recognition that tangible and intangible heritage is valued for differing reasons and motivations by residents, tourists, politicians, employers, municipal governments, developers, and the preservation community. And this approach, the Hull approach, is a collaboration for all urban heritage, capacity building, research, information, communication, and action. Stewardship of urban heritage is now conceived as a shared integrative undertaking that affirms that diverse heritage as sustainable element of the future. Thank you.